Of course, the Ocean Pier was the most prominent piece of infrastructure in what was in the bay at the time.
They could berth 2 ships on either side of it.
25 on each side of the sling, so that was 50 carcasses.
And then he got a bit more angle and I said, I'm off. So I took off down the pier and the wharfies were there at the time. And I started to walk down the pier because I knew what was going to happen. Next minute all the wharfies are passing me.
And in the 1920s he took, I think, every single ship that come into the harbour. And that's a very important part of our history that needs to be recorded.
Portland's Ocean Pier. Was it the biggest pier in Australia? I guess it's how you measure such things. The Port Germain Jetty in South Australia and the Busselton Jetty in WA both claim to be the longest, both at about a mile, or 1.6 kilometres. But these were small, narrow structures. Portland's was a far more substantial, being deeper and wider, with considerable shedding. To appreciate the length of the pier, it needs to be seen from the north, or side on, and almost no such photos exist, except for this one taken by George Duckworth from on top of the Sedco oil rig that was here in 1965. It shows the lee breakwater in the foreground and the timber pier in the middle of the picture. This rough old movie footage from 1960 gives another perspective as to the length of the pier.
They could berth 2 ships on either side of it at one stage, but the ships weren't the size of what they are today, of course. You've probably seen photos too of 2 ships tied up on either side. Used to work either side of it back. I don't know what years they would have been, but...
Port Melbourne Station and Princess Piers are wider, but shorter. But let's set them aside and claim that Portland's was the biggest, if not the longest or widest. What's wrong with a bit of parochialism? To us who remember it, it was a big pier, and the focal point of Portland in its day.
Of course, the Ocean Pier was the most prominent piece of infrastructure in what was in the bay at the time. On some Sundays, like others, occasionally, particularly if there was a ship at the pier, we could stroll out there unrestricted, and occasionally you could actually board the vessel and have a glass of something or other on the Sunday afternoon. Now that didn't happen too often, but nevertheless it was available.
I can remember going out there as a 10-year-old with a mate, walking onto a Japanese ship loading bagged wheat. My strongest memory of that was the strange aromas coming from the galley, and the Japanese men getting around in thongs, which we'd never seen before. I think we used to call them flip-flops. There wasn't the paranoia about safety and security that there is today. Now, going back to the beginning, the contract for the pier was let to Ross, Fraser and Patience, infrastructure builders. Their price was £13,300 for the first stage. The first pile was driven on the 18th of December 1899, and someone had the presence of mind to take a photo of it. An interesting old photo it is too. Pile driver on the left with the pile standing up ready to be driven. Steam engine on the right puffing away. A few piles in the foreground with points cut on them. Only short piles with the look of it, for where the pier crossed the beach in a big sweeping bend on its way from the railway station to Mr. Bath's and line up with Henty Street. The pier took a little over 2 years to build and was opened to great fanfare and ceremony in February 1902. The naval squadron was in the bay, as can be seen by the 5 naval ships in the background, and there was a freighter tied up at the end of the pier, flying flags. Obviously, the amount of timber used was tremendous, most of it local stringy bark and messmate. In this old photo we can see some piles in the foreground and then timber stacked all the way out the pier. And if we look out to the far right hand end, the outer end of the pier, looks to be a couple of pile drivers in position. Might have been the time of the pier extensions in 1914, 1916. Timber kept a lot of men employed. This was in the days of selective logging, of course. Not every log went to the sawmill. Trees were marked by the Forest Office for certain purposes. Tall trees for bridge and pier piles, big trees were marked for bridge and pier bearers, which were squared in the bush.
Yeah, they'd...
Might be Tim Hodgetts, was it?
Tim Hodgetts, yeah, mostly. Sometimes it was Dick Aldridge and Striggy Aldridge. They're very good. If there was a pile, they put a cross on it and you weren't to touch it, of course. And a beam, there's beams, well, they had to be a big log and they'd had to cut they used it a lot down here in the harbour in the early days. But they had the beam cutters.
There was a well over in that area, just over there, where old Rocky Ned Kent, we all knew him as Rocky Ned, he used to camp there, and Jack King, using the broad axe for cutting beams. He would pick his timber. He'd wander the bush to find a nice straight tree, a straight grain tree, not a curly tree, you see, because a curly tree would naturally be much harder to broad axe than a straight grained one. And that's what he'd done. He would fall the tree, cut it into the required length, and then he'd get the broad axe and take a slither off the side, off one side, you see. And then, if the log was big enough, he would cut a V into the top of the log, right through a V, you see. And that would keep the beam nice and straight, you see. He'd do that on one side and then on the other, and then he'd perhaps have to use a wedge to wedge it so that he could bust it open. And once he got it opened up, well, then he would take the sapwood off the sides and get the required beam. That they were about 12 feet long, the beam, and then they would finish up 12 inches by 8 inches. Yeah.
Everything was carted by bullock wagon, a slow and laborious operation. 70-foot piles overhang the wagon by a long way. Not that these are piles, are obviously logs for the sawmill. Jack Outram in command. 99-year-old Jack Kerr has a family connection with this wonderful old photo.
Well, it's true that my uncles are out there getting those logs for the pier, and to make sure that they got the length, they grubbed some of the trees to get the right length. Fortunately, the war started.
This is the First World War.
The logs had been taken down to the pier. They took them into Haywood and put them on a flat top truck, a rower truck, and they were sent to Portland. But then, when the war started, the inspections came along and they didn't want to go on with the pier, so they just condemned the logs.
So you reckon there was nothing wrong with the logs, but
no, nothing wrong with them, but they didn't want to go on with the pier. So once the logs were condemned, it broke them, so they joined the army.
Right. So Jack's uncles joined the army and went to France and sadly didn't come back. The amount of timber used in these big wooden piers is staggering. This is the partly demolished station pier in Port Melbourne, showing a sea of piles. The authorities have had the forethought to save a section of pier showing how it was constructed, complete with piles, beams and bracing. The Portland pier comprised almost 2,000 piles, with just as many logs cut up for beams and decking. This is a photo taken during the demolition of the Portland Pier, also revealing a sea of piles with the decking removed. The Portland Harbour Trust also had the vision to preserve one of the piles from the old pier. It stands on the foreshore today as a little reminder of what went before. Norm Smith, who joined the Harbour Trust in 1952, may even have had a hand in driving this pile originally, given that he was involved in repair work on the pier during the 1950s. I had a chat with Norm about it and began by asking him how long it would take to knock a pile in.
I don't know, wouldn't be that long, maybe
Half an hour or 10 minutes?
Oh, no, it'd be a bit shorter than that, about a quarter of an hour to knock a pile in.
Yes.
I think it depends on the bottom of it too.
So did you have to go down till you hit rock, or
No,
just go to a certain depth?
yeah. That there, it's about 2 tonne he was, because you lift it, that was winch driven. Lift him up with the winch and drop him, 3-4,
2 tonne.
yeah, and drop him down on the pile.
Would you go about that far at a time, depending on the bottom?
Some of them used to do a bit tight, but some of them used to hit something soft, you know, they'd go down pretty quick and, or part of the way, but you'd have to keep at them. But, no, it wasn't too bad.
So getting back to the story of the pier, it was only a little over 2 years from the first pile being driven till the pier was opened. A pretty fair effort, I would have thought. The pier that we remember, as old-timers, had a big end on it. Ships could berth both sides and there was shedding up the middle. However, it wasn't built that way. It was a fairly narrow affair. Here's an old sailing ship come steamship, auxiliary vessel, tied up on the south side. Obviously, not too long after the pier was built. This is another interesting picture. There's a vessel at the end of it on the south side, but she's either rolling with the swell or she's got a list on it because she's unloading timber. But it's still the small pier. It wasn't extended and widened till, as I've said, around 1914-16. By the way, the sawmiller to get the contract for cutting the decking for the extensions to the pier, 1914-16, was Hogan, Fry and King. And this is a photo of their sawmill, said to be at Shines Waterhole, Cockatoo Valley Road. And there they are with the crew standing up on the bark heap for the photograph. Would have been a big deal in 1916. Needless to say, pier repairs were ongoing. This is a wagon load of decking timber leaving Pedrazzi's mill at Garay in 1942, with a couple of particularly long lengths of timber on top, needed for some special purpose, I guess. Burst Pedrazzi was about the last horse teamster in the area, in this photo with a load of logs. In the 58 years that the pier was in use, the method of cargo handling changed but a little. Rail trucks were pushed out onto the pier by steam engine and positioned alongside the ship by horse. Freight was moved by manpower from rail trucks into slings to be hauled aboard and dropped into the hold and stowed by hand, bag by bag and box by box.
Yeah, I was 16 when I started down there. Son Keeler was, they called him a supervisor, I suppose. He's the one that the allocation for labour and that sort of thing. Ian Campbell, they done the allocations for labour.
I started there, we a bit slack out in the orchard at that particular time, and it was about in 1948. I was 14-year-old and I got taken in, I'm not sure by who, whether it was Harris Flower or...
I first went to Harbour Trust 1952 and I was there for nearly 40 years.
Yeah, I'll get you a job, he said, so I lined up down there I was in my teens when that happened, and it was good. Good money. And
when a ship was due in, labour would be picked up. Waterside workers union men first, then casuals second. A lot of these casuals were farmers developing their farms, The casual aspect of the job suited them well, depending on what had to be done at home. For a long time, Andrew Keeler, who we always knew as son, and who lived to be 100, was the pickup man. I got picked up once, only did one shift, loading meat in cartons. I was 15 at the time. Anyway.
Yeah, we used to call him old son. I suppose he was only in his he'd be 50s or something when I started there, but he was there for a long time. He worked for all the different stevedoring companies. He'd done the allocation of the labour, well, part of it, not all of it. Ian Campbell had certain sections he used to do. Yeah. No, they were good old blokes.
And Sonny would always be down there, and he would blow the whistle at 10, 12 minutes past whatever, after smoko, so you were back on the job at right on time. Yeah.
It was a seasonal sort of a job between, say, October and March. Be frozen mutton, a lot of it.
We used to stack a lot of lamb for England in bags in those days. They'd load the lambs out at Bothwick's. They'd come down by a rail truck.
The carcasses would use 25 on each side of the sling, so that was 50 carcasses. And then on the butter there would be 60 blocks. Cheese were put up on trays, and there was 14 to the tray. The cheeses were probably the heaviest and the most dangerous.
We loaded quite a bit of milk, condensed milk and that from Nestles over Warrnambool. And then coffee beans came on the scene as well, important coffee beans over at Dennington.
Barrels of butter from Mount Shank in Mount Gambier, and
that would be the main ones, and a fair bit of wool, of course. They were all in that one season. All those things would be loaded. I never worked on unloading coal. The coal used to be unloaded for the gasworks in those times, and but I never worked on that. I don't know how often those boats come in, say once a month or something. I don't know how many tonne they were unloaded.
Butter was in 56-pound boxes.
Well, it was all done by hand, of course. I think it was about 59 before the first forklift arrived here with Harold Lether. That wasn't real successful on the Ocean Pier because of the planks and the gaps and railway lines and stuff. It didn't take much for the small wheels to drop in one of those and hold things up. But that was the start of the mechanisation, I suppose, whatever you like to call it.
While ships were usually the main subject of these old photos, we can glean other information on what was happening on the side or in the background. We can see from some of these photos that steam engines went right the way out the pier in the early days. A tremendous weight on a timber structure, I would have thought.
Remember the train going out there, towing out the butter and the carcasses and louver trucks, and then after that it must have got a bit rickety because they used horses then to pull them out.
The train engine used to push the trucks out to about 3/4 of the way out, where the bend in the pier was. That's as far as they'd push them.
We could only guess that this was due to the ageing of the pier by the 1950s. Horses were used to haul rail trucks into position for unloading. We see in most photos cleats nailed to the pier decking to provide grip for the horses. Draft horses were so common those days that people rarely took photos of them. Yet in a few photos we see them off to the side or in the background. The two exceptions are this one with horse driver Claude Buglehole posing with one of his horses, and this with Claude standing near the back of the horse. A tractor replaced horses in the 1950s. Looks like Drew Murrell in the seat on this occasion. With this big pier project, We are very fortunate to have so many period photos to work with, photos being such an important window into our past. I've used photos from both the Vernon McCullum collection and the Portland Cultural Collection, plus a few privately owned. We are also indebted to Ern Andrews, Portland photographer, who had a shop in Percy Street.
Ernest Andrews was a photographer, operated in Portland from just pre-1920s through to 1960s, his wife. And he loved taking photos of ships. And in the 1920s he took, I think, every single ship that came into the harbour. He made it his point to head down to the harbour and take photos of the ships. And I've been scanning the photos and collection that we've got here at History House. Glass plates. I thought there was about 5,000 originally. I've done about 3,000, and I reckon I've got probably another 4,000 or 5,000 at least to go. So fair collection. So who knows what we'll find in the rest of them. Toy was another photographer that took a lot of historic photos around the town. Not only did he take ones out on the wharf of the shipping, but he took quite a few in town itself to show what the streets and that were like. And that's a very important part of our history that needs to be recorded, and that's what we were trying to do, was to put as many as we can together, so that the people know who took the photos and that. He produced postcards as well. There's quite a few of them still about, actually. I know there's some more of them too, but we haven't got them yet.
The old photos show that there was a platform running up the middle of the pier for storage of cargo, built to the height of the floor of a railway track, for obvious reasons. Grain shipments commenced from Portland in 1921. It was estimated that a bag of grain was handled a colossal 37 times between the farm and reaching its destination in Europe. The shed was built in 1922, likely for the storage of grain. This photo shows where grain has been covered with a tarpaulin, awaiting shipment or completion of the shed. This photo is amusing to us in this day and age. It shows a 6-foot-high fence on the pier adjacent to the baths, made of roofing iron. It seems the purpose of this was to prevent the wharfies from seeing people in the baths, for, heaven forbid, they might see a bit of skin, or even a bit of leg. When editing these little videos, one can't always find the exact photos needed, so one has to compromise. There were a lot of photos taken in the 1920s, but far fewer taken in the 1950s. So when our interviewees are speaking of loading ships in the 1950s, I'm often using photos of an earlier era and older model ships. For example, this photo was taken in 1960, this one in 1922. Anyway, getting back to loading the ships. There were wharfies on the pier, in the ship stowing cargo and operating the derricks with winches. There was also the hatchman. So what was the hatchman's job? Was he to signal?
Yeah, he'd signal the two. Because the winches were on the deck of the ship, and the derricks went up, and because they couldn't see down in the hull, he direct which way to take it, and
I know he had to watch out when they were coming down. He had to make sure and get back underneath because they sway a bit, and
warn the workers below to get out of the road before it came in, and when it was going out, they had to get back out of the road in case something run amiss and come crashing down again. Yeah, that was. I think the safety was real good in those days.
I don't think there's any accidents while I was there.
If Hatchman brought cargo over while men are still working in the square, as it was called, there used to be called a few names for doing that, but it didn't happen very often. It only happened by mistake, really. It wasn't intentional or anything like that.
And some of the winch drivers, I don't know whether they were ever sober either. Some of those blokes, they were bits of characters, and it was it was a pretty dangerous job, really. Nowadays, they've got to have their wits about them. The winch drivers are very important.
The Melbourne wharves were notorious for pilfering, but of course that wouldn't happen in Portland.
Pilfering, somebody said this. I don't remember pilfering. I don't know of anybody who did. I know it happened.
Yeah, they'd pinch things, anything they could lift, they'd pinch it. Yeah. I think that was part of the deal, and then smuggle it out in a tucker bag, or the favourite things were shackles, and yeah, that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. We used to have canned fruits come from somewhere too. They'd accidentally drop a carton of that and bust it open, and it'd be a hell of a scramble to get a can of fruit to take home. It was all part of the job. Yeah, yeah.
I know we used to be able to buy cheap cigarettes off the sailors. They were very cheap. I think we paid 10p for 10 in the tobacconists, and I think they were only about 6p for 10, or, yeah. No, I think they might have come in 20s actually.
Yeah, I've even seen them get the cheese out with a pocket knife. The slats had gaps of about 1/2 inch or so. Folks could get their pocket knife there and cut a strip out of the cheese. But yeah, that had to go to London, that cheese. Well, it didn't give it a good name, did it? Australian cheese. But that didn't worry the wharfie. So.
The first oil tanker berthed at the pier in 1929. Fuel was pumped through pipes that followed the railway line out to the tank farm in Kennedy Street. With the closing of the pier, tankers moored at a purpose-built berth on the lee breakwater. Portland Bay is wide open to all weather from the southeasterly quarter, what mariners would term an open roadstead. Tremendous seas would build up during southeasterly gales.
You just get big seas coming in those times, big swells, because you never had your Anderson Wharf and all that sort of thing.
No breakwater.
No breakwater, see.
When this was southeast, you'd hardly get out the old pier, because there'd be space underneath and the water would be coming up between the deck, and the waves were nearly as high as the wharf anyway at times. Seen it like that. The waves would be coming over the old fisherman's breakwater, just ploughing over that.
Yeah.
And some days the sea was that rough, the swell was that great, the ship would go out 8 feet and then come back in again, and if it got more than 8 feet they'd call it a day and say too much overboard. And it was cheese or carcasses? No, don't remember. But anyway, something fell into the sea, and one of the wharfies jumped in and brought it to shore, and he was allowed to take the rest of the day off.
A lot of times on the ship when you're up there, you can feel it moving around all the time while you're working.
Yeah.
Or just back and forwards or in and out. And there was times when they've had to let everyone get off and let the thing go back out to sea when the weather was picking up worse and worse, and anchor out till it was calm enough to come back in again. Yeah, that happened at various times. Yeah.
With thousands of tons of ship surging backwards and forwards and in and out, the forces at play were tremendous. To soften the stresses, spring ropes and spring piling were employed. This was long before synthetic ropes and rubber fenders had been invented, of course. Ropes were a vegetable fibre, either sisal, manila or coir. Coir is made of coconut husk fibre, which has some elasticity or spring in it. This coir rope, made of coconut fibre, had to be very big and thick to withstand the stresses involved. I've seen these rope springs back in the day when I used to go down on the pier. You can see one here lying along the edge of the pier, possibly 8 inches thick. So heavy to handle that a little hand-operated crane on wheels was used to retrieve it when it was let go from the ship.
The same as undoing it, they used to drop it over the side because they let it go, and then the old, like a little mobile crane. And when they drop it down, sometimes it's over the side, and that crane, the little crane hooks up to it and wind it up on the deck. And sometimes she'd be, you know, I thought, it's going to go in the water, but no.
Nothing much stopping it from falling over.
Tipping over, no.
This old collier, the River Fitzroy, has 3 springs leading up to her bow, which are attached to the ship with steel cables. You'll see on the right that she is using a grab to fill rail trucks with coal. This coal would have been destined for the Portland Gasworks, once situated next to the powerhouse, which is now the Car Museum at the bottom end of Percy Street. Once the ship's crew let these springs go, it was quite a job for the wharf crew getting these springs back up onto the pier. Just note the size of the steel eyes in the end of these springs. They were part of the pier infrastructure and stayed on the pier for ships to use. Deploying them was quite a job. So can you explain to us, and to the viewer, the method of tying up? Like getting the lines ashore and all that?
Yeah, off the boat itself, the ship, they throw you a thin line, then when you got that, they tie a cable on it, and you pull in, try and get the cable in. And then they'd have to thread it through that long one there.
The big heavy one?
Yeah, and get it back onto the boat.
Okay.
Get it back to the ship. I don't know, they must have to chuck the line back and thread the cable through the eye and then pull it back onto the boat to hook it up.
And then they'd winch it in with the ship's winches?
Yeah, they pull it in with the ship. Yeah, they'd have to pull the cable in by hand and hook it on the winch, then tighten it up on up that rope or the springs. But that'd be a fair bit of work in days, like that heavy stuff like that and heavy cable.
Of course, we must remember there was no tug in Portland those days, and these old steamships were ungainly vessels, not easy to manoeuvre. The ship had to come in alongside as best she could, as close as she could without hitting the pier, sometimes too far off, and she'd just have to get the lines ashore and winch herself in. And that white fishing boat, the old Cuda boat there in the middle ground, we took the pilot out to the ship and then acted as a line boat to run lines ashore when the ship was too far off to use heaving lines. From the 1920s through till about 1950, a character by the name of Fatty Fredericks had the job of taking the pilot to the ships and working as a line boat to bring lines ashore from the ship. A boat that he had for 20 odd years was a pilotter, so named because he was the man who took the pilot out. He used to also take trips around the bay for 2 bob. Here's a little old ticket office for the pilotter, Bay Cruises. Very blurry old photo, unfortunately. Getting back to the pilot for a moment, there's a famous incident that involved Captain Brown when he actually miscalculated and collected the pier at some speed, with obvious consequences.
Anyway, he was trying to bring it in. There was a southeast wind pushing it away. So he was coming in along the pier and then was pushing away. And then he got a bit of an angle and tried to come in, against that way. And then he got a bit more angle and I said, I'm off. So I took off down the pier. And the wharfies were there at the time. And I started to walk down the pier because I knew what was going to happen. Next minute all the wharfies are passing me and crash. He went in. It was the only thing he could have done. And one bloke was in the toilet, and when the boat hit the pier, because that's moved over, and he wondered what was going on. He jumped up, tried to open the door, and being the pier moved over, jammed the door on him. He couldn't get out. Oh, gee, you reckon he got a fright? But anyway, Brownie, I remember that, Captain Brown.
The toilet was housed on beams below the main deck level of the pier. It was basic, well-ventilated, self-cleaning, economical and effective.
Then go downstairs and the sea was the the recipient. Yes, no. And the seating there, yeah, you were up high enough so you never had a wash bottom, but
The white guardrail in this photo shows where the steps down to the toilet were. Not that anyone needs to know. As I said before, the bay is open to swells from the southeast. In order to protect the main structure of the pier from thousands of tons of ships surging against it, the outer row of piles was independent and not attached to the pier itself, the spring and the pile timber absorbing much of the surge energy.
Spring piling, that's all better, all named. And separate piles with it that weren't hooked up there. Well, there's about 3 piles along in the spring piling, and they used to just move. They weren't sort of tied up to anything.
Not part of the pier.
No, they were fastened to the other piles.
I asked Roger Haldane if he could do a sketch of how this spring piling worked.
We're not sure quite what the system was. We've got a pretty good idea. So we're just going to do a drawing now, which should be pretty close to what we think it is. Well, it seems that there was a bank of 4 piles. They were a little bit further out from the main piles, so these are the main jetty piles here. And it appears that the jetty decking and capping sort of came over these spring piles, so the ship would have come alongside and the force would have been that way. So this spring pile here took the load off the main jetty that maybe had a joining piece here that went along, and it secured the 4 piles. So there have been 4 piles in a bank like that, with a piece tying those together.
Like a capping, heavy capping.
Yeah, a capping or a heavy timber bolted along to tie them together, so that when the ships came alongside, the 4 piles took the force of that sideward force. So you've got this happening all the way across here.
And there'll be several gangs of 4, those 4 piles every few feet.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure of that, but we'll like this would have been your bollard here for tying up. That would have had a steel cap with a band on it to protect the pile from the splitting. These piles were braced like this right across the wharf. Your decking here, a quite big heavy decking they would have had on the wharf here. Yeah, so that's sort of about as close as what we can find. Not been able to find any photos or drawings, but yeah. So that was especially in ports like Portland where there was surge. This took and of course we had strong winds here as well. So these took the load off the main jetty, because they would have gone right down to the seabed there, and and it would have made a great habitat for fish.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that should do. By the 1950s, the old pier was half a century old and about up to its use-by date. Anyway, it was kept in use till the new K.S. Anderson Wharf was completed in 1960.
Yeah, there's always something to do there, like decking or piles, pull out the old piles and replace them. Beams underneath, down on the water line and that were renewed. There's always something to do like that.
It would seem that the authorities may have been a little over-optimistic in 1915 when they extended the pier to allow 2 ships to berth each side. While photos do show 3 and 4 ships berthed at times, it would seem to be not too common. By the 1950s, the south side was falling into disrepair and was unsafe to even walk on, while on the north side I never saw more than one ship at a time, though those ships would have been quite a bit bigger than the average freighter of 1915. Ken Douglas, log hauler, carted some of the last piles to go into the pier.
I think we got those piles from up in Anya Forest. They were the last ones I carted down there, and they were 72 feet long, I think. Around about the 72 feet, I think they took them. And brought them in at after 5 o'clock, after everybody knocked off down there, and I had to back around, of course. Well, there's holes in the pier from the old sleepers. There's holes in the pier everywhere, so you had to be very careful. And unloaded them myself, of course, on my own, because there's no one about.
Once the new KS Anderson wharves were opened in 1960, no further maintenance was carried out on the old pier, though it was used occasionally for ships to tie up for a range of reasons. Actual dismantling did not begin until 1968, when due to drought there was a work for the dole scheme to provide employment. In the months that the scheme was in operation, the pier was dismantled back as far as the outer end of the shed. The job was eventually completed in 1972. The decking was removed and taken ashore on rail trolleys. Then the piles had to come out. Pull the piles out with the Lewis or one of them?
You pull them with, yeah. Yeah, like when I pull them down, the Lewis pull they just chop them off at the, I don't know, you might get 2 or 3 in one lot. Some of them are a bit longer, you used to have to break them off. And that's how they got them in. There's a lot of piles in that wharf and jetty.
So it was all gone by 1972, just 70 years after it was opened.
Of course, you could understand that we had a whole range of interesting characters right across the organisation.
Well, I guess everybody was a character. Old Bob Taylor was a cold character.
What did he do?
Bob worked on the wharf. And I remember that one of the cheeses went across his top of his nail there, thumb, took the skin off, and he went to the axle of
The wagon.
the wagon and rubbed it with grease.
And kept on working?
Kept on working, yeah.
One of those characters was Joe Ryanson, known as Two Thumb Joe or Joe the Fire Eater.
He was a character, fire eater. We had a social night, he'd always be putting on an act with these fire eating. When he got half drunk, he used to make a bit of a blue sometime. Like he'd throw up the sultanas, he'd put them in he'd get sultanas in some fire there, and he'd throw one up and miss it half the time, be hitting here, and he'd be rubbing himself, and because everyone cheered him, and he's a bit of fun. Come to work the next day, and he'd have all these little burnt spots around on his face where he missed the sultanas.
Norman Smith, I think, might have worked on the Ocean Pier, and what he was noted for was the exceptional way that he could dredge up nicknames for some of his work colleagues. Now, I can't recall some of them, but I do remember they were so clever, and he was miles ahead of anybody else in allocating nicknames to different people.
Yeah, it was Ted Dawkins. He was always known as a strong man as far as lifting goes. If someone would bet him a beer or two, he'd be in anything to. He'd lift half the pier up, I think, for a few beers. He was known to carry 2 coils of plain wire, 100 weight each, the length of the pier for a bet, yeah.
One under each arm?
On his shoulders, yeah, across his shoulders. Walk straight down That was nearly a mile.
So 100 weight's about...
200, yeah, well, you got 200 weight altogether, 100 weight on each coil. Ken Seignan from out at Heathmere, he used to carry 83 kilogram bag of wheat under each arm.
Yeah. Right. Pretty fair effort.
That was a big effort, yeah. Well, I thought it was a good effort.
This is obviously not Ken Seignan, but it seems challenges were not rare. The caption on this old photo reads, G. Bell carried this bag of wheat from the sheds to the shore end of the long pier in 1922.
No, they're always a good bunch of fellas to work for, yeah. Or work with, I should say.
You always cash money, you always got paid in cash.
Probably 10 or 15 ships, but then Dad bought another orchard and we had to, there was no time for wharf, so